There's different types of insurance programs. There's revenue protection, there's yield protection. Of course, there's an LDP system, which is called a loan deficiency payment system, in place in the US for a long time too. And if crop prices get below a certain point, then the government makes up the difference, So that's kind of a subsidy, if you like. It just depends on the market and the year and the system, For example, you can insure your revenue up to 85% of what you had over the last 5 years, or you could insure it to 65%, and the premium then will adjust accordingly,
As harvest is only a few weeks away, inevitably farmers are looking at grain markets and reading more keenly about the harvests from Russia, South America and the US. All of these regions will have a bearing on the grain price achieved in Ireland over harvest. You are listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. The occasional reports we see on TV about American farming generally reports about the extremes rather than the everyday experience. I'm delighted today to be joined by Laois man Brian Caldbeck, who is farming and running a seed business in the US, to chat about the conditions at the moment and what to expect over the coming months in the region closest to him. Brian, thanks very much for joining us. I know you're on your holidays here in Ireland at the moment, but just to remind everyone, you might just remind us where you're based in the US and the type of farming in the region closest to you.
So we're based in Kentucky there, which is kind of in the eastern Midwest, southeastern Midwest, if you like. And the area is, we live close to the Ohio River, which kind of runs down through the Midwest there. And we're on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River. And so probably 900 miles or 800 or 900 miles in from the East Coast, and maybe 6 or 7 hours south of Chicago, right there in the middle, a little bit north of Nashville. So
slap bang in the middle of it all.
Yeah, right, absolutely. Yeah,
bang in the middle of it. And you were saying that it's gone very warm out there at the moment, Brian.
Yeah, we're most days now it's probably 30 to 35 degrees centigrade, and at night time it's probably 25. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of crop growth at the minute. It's turned off dry. We've had a really, really wet spring. Planting was delayed, and now a lot of the crops had to be replanted, and now the crops are small and like late planted barley or anything. You just really don't know what's going to happen now. It depends on the conditions from now on out. If it gets rain at the right time and if it doesn't get too hot when it's trying to pollinate and all the rest. So there's a little bit of apprehension on the the status for some of the crops at the minute, and how they look, and the conditions that we're going to see over the next few weeks. When you plant late, you're always pushing it. You're going to be running there when it's a little bit wet, trying to get it planted, and oftentimes a lot of seedbed compaction goes on, and then you have these little small roots, and the crop needs to grow fast, and the roots are compacted, and the heat really works on those plants. They don't really have much of a foundation under them to withstand the stress, when it gets hot and dry,
Sure. We understand that late spring very well here, because we had a very late one here, but not so much the heat. I suppose, Brian, a lot of people would probably, when they're envisaging American farming, for the most part, maize would be the first thing that would come to their mind. Is there much maize in your kind of more immediate area? Because I would imagine that probably stands up to the heat that bit better, does it?
Yeah, I mean, the rotation, we're very heavily populated with maize. It's 50% of the cropland. Most farmers will, in our area will have especially further up into the Midwest, but even in our area, if they plant wheat, they don't plant wheat every year unless the market's good, but it's 50% maize and 50% soybeans. The rotation flip-flops, from one year to the next. That's how they rotate, really, is corn and soybeans, and or maize and soybeans. So yeah, so maize stands up to it pretty good, and beans are pretty good to stand up to it too. Beans are a very heat tolerant crop too. Soybeans, I mean.
And you mentioned the spring barley a second ago, but in terms of the soybeans or maize, did they need to be replanted, or were they sown a little bit later anyway, and they probably got over the worst of it?
No, we had a lot of soybean replanting and a lot of maize replanting.
All right. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so they're kind of looking a bit. Is it just immediately kind of in your particular area, or does that go a little further up towards the Midwest, where that late spring, that
Yeah.
wet spring was there, and they're not looking as good, or the yield potential maybe is not there as much as other years maybe.
Right, yeah, if you go up into, we're close to Illinois there, and if you go up into Illinois and into Indiana, I mean, there was a lot of, there was a terrible lot of rain in April and May, like I think we had 18 inches of rain or something in April and between April and May, it's way above average. So up into the areas where they produce a lot of corn and beans, like some of the more dominant corn and bean states. Definitely the planting was delayed, and as I said, the crop's a little bit behind now, and because of that. So yeah, no, it's pretty widespread wet period, and of course on the other side of that rain really helped the wheat yields out in Kansas and Oklahoma, where they had hardly any wheat out there last year, but now they're making. A guy in Kansas told me the other day he's getting 2 ton of hard red wheat, winter wheat to the acre, which is, they're really happy with that yield. Last year it was pretty much nothing, but so the wheat yields have, the moisture has been good out west, but it's been a little bit excessive in the east, where we don't need as much of it.
But I suppose on one side of the moisture is, another years you'd be talking about recharging the soil, and would have dry winters and maybe not so much water there to push on crops towards the end. But now you might have enough moisture, but a later sown crop, and if those crops get big heat for for an extended period, what's likely to happen then?
So as I said, the root systems aren't very well developed. So if we hit very high temperatures during maize pollination, we can definitely shave. Well, you could shave 50% off the yield, like in very quickly. We haven't had that 12 years ago. I think 2012 was the last time. I remember in 2012 in Kentucky there, we hit a year where we got really hot and dry like that. And, we were harvesting, half the corn yields, like 80 bushel corn versus, 150 to 200 bushel corn, so you can lose productivity pretty quick, in those sort of conditions.
When does that heat need to be? Is that more July, August heat, is it?
Yeah. July heat is really what causes the problems. And, the pollination thing is obviously a big concern, but corn, as you said, is pretty resilient to those conditions. But if you get an issue with pollination and then you have a soil profile that's drying out, because corn really uses a lot of water every week or, every day when it's 35 degrees and it really needs to stay cool. If you miss a couple of rains at that time and you have a bad root system, or a smaller root system due to late planting and it's not going down after the deep water in the profile, you'll definitely shave yield off in a hurry,
And around your side of the world, then, is there irrigation available or necessary most years?
We're not really in an irrigated area because we have so much rainfall. There are a few farmers who have invested in the systems, to get through these years when we do have less rain. We are in an area where sometimes we'll plant winter wheat and then we'll double crop soybeans. So we there's quite a bit of that, and those double crop soybeans can really benefit from that late irrigation, or that, because sometimes it doesn't rain, in July and August, and then they can irrigate. So they're kind of stabilizing their productivity, with those irrigation systems. But irrigation in our area is not very common, no.
Okay, and talking about, just going back to, where you have a year where there's a bit of a disaster in terms of either, flood or drought or really hot temperatures that you talked about a second ago, and God knows we've seen enough of it in Ireland over the last couple of years. For the American farmer, am I right in saying they don't really get direct support, but their support comes through kind of an insurance type of model where the insurance is subsidized. Is that generally how it works, or am I wrong in saying that?
No, that's correct. I mean, you don't have to opt for crop insurance, but if you're have operating loans or need to secure operating loans with banks or anything like that, which a lot of farmers will secure operating loans at the beginning of the year. They won't get that money unless they have signed up for crop insurance. The bank won't give it to them. So they're kind of locked into that, unless you're independently financed, and then which some farmers are independently financed and they don't bother with those. Crop insurance, they'll just write it out, and hope for the best. But most farmers will be opting for crop insurance. But like any insurance, most of the time it doesn't pay. You know, I mean, it only pays if the yields get below a certain level. And of course, nobody likes paying insurance, but everybody knows it's a safety net. You know, so I mean, that's the way it is. And so they pay a premium at the beginning of the year per acre. You know, depending on what level of coverage they want. There's different types of insurance programs. There's revenue protection. There's yield protection. Of course, there's an LDP system, which is called a loan deficiency payment system, in place in the US for a long time too. And if crop prices get below a certain point, you know, then the government makes up the difference. You know, so that's kind of a subsidy, if you like. You know, but just depends on the market and the year and the system. You know, for example, you can insure your revenue up to 85% of what you had over the last 5 years, or you could insure it to 65%. And the premium then will adjust accordingly, you know.
And how does that work in terms of you know, making a claim or judging whether your 80% is the same as your neighbor's 80% in terms of income? How does that work?
That's a good question. So you can have your individual basis, if you like, if you've got 3 or 4 years of history of insuring your crops, and then of course you have to turn in your yield records to the local government, FSA they call them. You have to turn in that every year. So then you build up your own yield history. So then, you know, they'll use that. And if you don't have that, they'll use the county average. You know, they'll go by county. And that's, of course, that's never as good, you know, because then, you know, some people don't have as good yields as other people. And then your county average yields are not going to be as good. But again, there's safety net if you don't have your own figures.
So going back to that then, so if I'm an individual farmer and I can turn in, as you say, turn in my yields, it's up to me whether I inflate them or deflate them. It doesn't really matter necessarily. But does that have an influence then on the premium that I would pay each year, whether I want to 60% or 80% of revenue insured? That makes a difference on that side. That's the kind of if you like, the stop point, if you like, for a farmer to make sure they're kind of honest, if you like.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you turn in your yields, I mean, you could be audited. You know, they could come and audit your system, and you'd have to say, okay, they want to look at your sales records and all the rest. You know, where you sold your grain, so they pretty much can kind of figure out all that. If they decide to select you as somebody that they want to, you know, make sure that everything's on the up and up, you know, they can figure that out pretty easily. You know, I mean, yeah, I mean that's the way. But I mean, there's always ways of you know, for people to manipulate the system a little bit, but usually that doesn't last very long. Somebody figures it out, you know.
So those figures are given to, if you like, the US government to a degree, or the state, not
Pretty much, yeah.
not necessarily the insurance company. Is it the insurance company who figures out if it's right or wrong, or is it the state inspecting some of that, whether it's right or wrong?
So the insurance companies really they just exist because that system is put in place by the government. So they're just basically providing that service and keeping up with it all. But at the end of the day, it's USDA or the federal government's writing the check. So yeah, that's how we really figured out at the end, you know.
And it just in the last, you know, in your region, say in the last 10 years, how much or how many times do you think that farmers would have leaned into that?
You know, 2012 was probably the year that everybody leaned into it pretty hard. Really, most people haven't got a whole lot from it since, you know, right now there's some people have signed up for what they call prevent planting, because they couldn't plant this year's corn crop, for example. It was too wet, or they had ground that they couldn't get in and plant. You know, they can put that into a program and get some revenue on that. You know, of course, it's not very much, but it's better than nothing. So probably pretty small uptake on a lot of that, you know, compared to 2012. But every year there's always something happens. You know, for example, I know a guy there last week. He had a winter canola, and you know, the hailstorm came on it. You know, I had a bad hailstorm through the area, and he had hail insurance on it, so he cashed in on that. You know, which, you know, that was a good program and all the rest. But you know, so there's always isolated incidents like that every year. But again, it's relatively small most years. You know.
And just in range of a kind of a premium, give or take. I know you can go for higher or lower, but give or take, is it $50 an acre? Is it $20 an acre, give or take?
It could be anywhere from 10 to 40, I'd say, or 10 to 50 maybe, yeah.
Somewhere there, depends what you want to go for. So it's not prohibitive necessarily to have a really low level backstop. That's I suppose is really what you're saying, but it can be quite expensive if you want to go for the top end of it. But you probably want to be in a fairly tricky area to a degree to really kind of make it pay over time.
Yes, correct, yeah. Correct. So most people they'll meet the requirements for their lender their lender has a requirement and they'll meet that requirement and then they'll go on.
Okay. The impression I was across in the States about, geez, nearly 10 years ago now, but one of the impressions I got from, we were a little bit further south from where you were, kind of North Dakota and up around there. But the bit that I kind of got from there was that it seemed to me that a lot of people were, or have changed, or were in the process of changing their establishment system to try and get maybe a more stable yield over time. Now, maybe it was just the farms we were brought to. Is that the sense that you get maybe in your region, in a general sense, that people have changed from maybe a more plow-based or chisel-based, whatever they call it in the States, kind of system into a more min-till direct drill type system?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty accurate. I mean, there have been and there continues to be government programs promoting cover cropping and no-till and the NCRS, which is the National Resource Conservation Service. They're big into helping farmers with programs to try and reduce soil erosion, be it wind erosion or water erosion. And that all stems back to the 1930s when they had the dirt bowl, the dust bowl, and they put that into place when Washington DC got covered up with a whole lot of soil that blew in from Oklahoma, which had been going on for several years, but they didn't take any notice of it. But at that point, it did. So there's quite an effort in place to try and stop that erosion, But of course, you don't have to sign up for it. You can still go ahead and plow and do all you like. But most farmers, see the benefits of protecting their soils. But it always helps to have a little bit of assistance, in doing these things and maybe putting cover crops down or, adopting no-till and all the rest, So, yeah, I would say you're right. There's an effort towards, maybe more minimally based establishments, no-till or min-till. And again, some of that's been driven by labor shortages, efficiency in equipment. There's several things comes into that.
Yeah, I suppose it'd be similar here in Ireland, as you know. I think a lot of it's probably driven by that, in as much as people are, there's obviously a drive by lots of people to try and improve their soil along the way, and they're very much there's some people go the whole hog in terms of it's an entire system as they would see it, but. I just wondering in an American kind of context, is there unintended consequences of that in terms of, I know there's lots of maize and Roundup and that kind of stuff, but are weeds building up a little quicker there where you don't have that option about turning down some of the really tricky weeds?
Yeah, I mean, you're probably selecting for certain types of weeds. It seems like in no-till you have certain species, like we have a weed we call mare's tail out here that's selected very much for in no-till situations. So there's probably some of that. Thankfully, we have a very, very strong portfolio of herbicides, residual herbicides. So no-till probably is really depends on using a lot of herbicides, particularly residual herbicides. I mean, glyphosate is an integral component of that as well. But, with weed resistance and everything, glyphosate has to be supplemented, which, makes sense. Spraying one chemical doesn't work very long anyway on something, so it has to be supplemented with the residuals. And, there is pressure right now on, trying to remove atrazine from the market. As an example, you guys lost atrazine here several years ago. But that's meeting a lot of resistance from corn growers and all the rest. And so that's, we have thankfully have most of those chemicals, still registered, but they're a very important part of no-till and keeping on top of all these weeds, So yeah, absolutely. You definitely have to change the way you do things when you start no-tilling, there's no doubt about that.
Interesting you say there about atrazine. Is that because of pressure from environmental groups, or is it straightforward that is turning up in rivers and water and that kind of stuff, and it just needs to be reduced from that point of view.
Yes, environmental groups, EPA. I mean, somebody, some group or entity will mention that there's an issue with something, and then that'll precipitate a test in the rivers or in the stream sediments or whatever, and then they'll find it. Obviously, they're going to find some herbicide residues in sediments in rivers in the US Midwest. I mean, that's just a fact of life. There's so much of it used, and you have a big storm and some of that soil goes in the river. I mean, there's going to be herbicides in it, and so yeah, it's going to be in there. And so yes, it's a response to finding those things, and then they'll look at that and do an analysis on that, and see, well, if this is not safe, or is it something we can tolerate or whatever, and just go through that process, and see, well, do we need to keep it or not, so yeah.
I can just listen. I can hear some of Irish farmers screaming at the podcast radio, whatever they're listening to it at the moment, kind of thinking, here, this fella's talking about all these herbicides that these lads can use over there, and we can't use them at all, and yet they're dictating the price with their corn in Ireland. It's a frustration, obviously, but look, that's just the way it is. The EU is very different to the States.
Absolutely, yeah, and we have some of the same thing over here. European farmers have access to some stuff that US farmers don't have, and they say the same thing. We want to use that too, because those guys are able to do it, and they're producing this crop more efficiently than we are, and it's the same thing everywhere. Absolutely.
Same argument. What's it to say? It's the same conversation in every house, isn't it? I suppose it is.
Yeah.
Listen, Brian, I'm after taking more than enough out of the holidays, because you're off to do something good today, I'm sure. So listen, thanks very much for joining us today. Have a great holiday. And look, we'll talk to you again when you get back to the States.
Okay, Michael. Yeah, thanks. Nice to see you again.
So that's it for this week. If you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review, and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.